At this point in time, can you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President John F. Kennedy by himself? Don't make your decision until you see Executive Action, possibly the most controversial motion picture of our time.
Start the target.
A film that nobody would make until now.
Fire!
Never before in American history has one family held such an enormous concentration of political power. The plan is perfectly plain. 2 terms for JFK, 2 for Bobby, and 2 for Ted.
Which makes action now imperative.
What kind of action?
Executive.
Burt Lanchaster,
I'll take it from here, Bob.
Robert Ryan, and Will Geer take executive action in a drama where startling fiction challenges established facts.
Okay, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this podcast and every other podcast I do by going to porkinspolicyreview.com. Well, I know it has been God only knows how long since we've had a new Porkins Policy Radio episode, and I apologize for all the various delays and everything like that, but it's just been a very busy time right now. But I am excited to be back on my main podcast, and where I really do have quite a bit of fun doing this show. And apologies again for everybody for waiting so long. But we're back, and it's a little bit special podcast because this is our 35th episode, which is a little bit of a milestone for me. When I first started the podcast, I couldn't imagine doing 5 of them was pretty intense. But now we're at 35, so that's great. And who better to join us on this 35th special episode than our very good friend Tom Secker, who of course is the man behind Clandestine, which you can find on spyculture.com, as well as Disinfowars on boilingfrogspost.com. Tom is also my partner in crime on the CIA and Hollywood series. And of course, faithful listeners will know that Tom gave me my first big break when he picked this plucky young podcaster for episode 6 of his podcast, Clandestine, where we discussed the Westgate Mall attack. So, Tom, thanks so much again for joining us.
It's great to be talking to you again, Pierce. I don't know what to say after that intro.
Well, it's the 35th episode, so we got to pull out all the stops here.
Fair enough.
But anyway, we're going to be discussing another film, and this is one that Tom actually recommended to me, and it's I should have it in front of me, but I don't. But I believe it came out in the 70s, and we'll get the exact date on that soon. But it is a movie called Executive Action, and this stars Burt Lanchaster, as well as Robert Ryan. It was directed by David Miller, and it is it came out actually also on an anniversary, the 10th anniversary of the JFK assassination, and it sort of tells the untold story of what really happened on that fateful day in November. And it was famous at the time because it was actually banned from the movie theaters. People were really quite upset about it, and it has a very interesting group of people involved in writing and researching the movie, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But Tom, I mean, you recommended this movie to me, and what I guess just sort of initially, what are your sort of thoughts on this film and what it's trying to do?
Well, I'm a big fan of 70s conspiracy thrillers, as you know, as I would be, of course. They're among my favorite cinema in America, certainly American cinema, and this one strikes me as being a bit different, because when you watch something like, the classic one is All the President's Men, where you've got 2 reporters, investigating this government conspiracy. But that's usually the setup, where you have an investigator, whether it's a journalist or a PI or whatever, finding out about this thing and gradually getting involved in it. In this, there's none of that. It's like an inverted conspiracy thriller, where there's no investigation. You're just being shown a conspiracy from the inside out. So there is no identifying with the character and buying into their journey as your journey. As they find out more, you find out more, because you just find out more through the course of this conspiracy developing. So it's a very, very different kind of conspiracy thriller, to my mind. It just functions in a different way. It responds, the audience respond to it differently because there's no real hero. There's no one you really identify with. There's no one, certainly I didn't, anyway.
No, of course not.
So yeah, it's just got a different dramatic dynamic, if you like, and that obviously has political repercussions and all the rest of it. But that is what really interests me about the film, or that's what interested me about it the first time I saw it, at least anyway. And that's kind of, the main reason why I suggested it to you. But obviously there is all this other stuff going on in the background of it, and actually in the film itself. So, I mean, what did you make of it? I mean, you've only watched it more recently than I have, so.
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed it a lot. It is actually a pretty exciting film. Particularly the whole assassination sequence is exciting. And it's exciting or interesting too in the way that it does so sort of openly portray a conspiracy. And we were just talking before we were recording about how there's this real sense of coldness throughout the movie. So just to quickly kind of break it down, there is this cabal of sort of conservatives and business oil executives and ex-intelligence black operatives that are basically angry at John F. Kennedy, of course, because he's a secret socialist or communist. He wants to leave Vietnam and have a test ban treaty with the Soviets. And one of them actually says that he's going to lead the Black Revolution, which is, of course, crazy for them, anything like that. And throughout the movie, there's a really big sort of emphasis on racial equality and how this is really what was behind killing JFK. Of course, I mean, I think that's sort of overdone, but just yet again another sort of attempt to portray JFK as a sort of hero saint who was gunned down. But as you said, it basically opens up with this cabal, this secretive group of people, sort of sitting around a table. Complaining about JFK, and they just sort of matter-of-factly state, well, we'll just have to assassinate him. That's just sort of the only thing that we can do. And of course you find out that some of these other people, particularly the Robert Ryan character, and there's another character called Ferguson, who's this sort of oil magnate, that they've already done this before in the past. I think they talk about it somewhere in the Middle East, like Jordan or something like that. They had to quell a little opposition group, and of course, they just assassinate them. That's just the easiest thing. And they just sort of matter-of-factly present that, and the movie just sort of progresses from there. And as you said, it's really, what I found most interesting was the idea that this is really from the conspirators' point of view. And the movie is interesting on another level as well, because it really sort of almost is directed in this sort of documentary feel. There's a lot of actual real footage of JFK, and it is interspliced in a way within the film, with newsreels and things, that it does feel like it's a documentary. So that's another really interesting idea that, you could almost imagine the sort of fly-on-the-wall documentary filmmaker filming this secretive cabal of businessmen and, conservative intelligence and ex-officials.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the elements on that, though, is that the film has that kind of cheap 70s made-for-TV quality about it. And you're right, that does very much contribute to this fly-on-the-wall, inside look at a conspiracy thing that's going on. But I think that was also a function of them not having an awful lot of money and having to spend all the money on getting people like Burt Lanchaster to be in the film. So. Yeah,
which is another bizarre choice. I don't even know what the hell Burt Lanchaster was doing. It does really have a cheap 70s feel, and there's actually an amazing copy of it on YouTube that looks like it was ripped off of VHS, and that's the one that I watched. And I'd actually encourage the listeners to go watch that one, because it really does make you feel like it is 1973 and you're watching this movie unfold. But Maybe we can get into some of the specifics, and maybe now we can just sort of briefly touch on who is involved in actually writing and researching this film. And the actual script was written by Dalton Trumbo, who's somebody that Tom, you've discussed several times on your podcast, and we'll get into him in some more specifics as well. And then the other two writer-researchers who sort of provided the story are two individuals who I hope some people in the community already are aware of, and that's Donald Freed and, more importantly, Mark Lane. And again, we're going to get into all of them later, but Mark Lane especially was sort of the kind of Alex Jones or Webster Tarpley of his time. He was the sort of first big alternative researcher. He wrote a book called Rush to Judgment, which came out shortly after the Warren Commission, and it was somehow it was the national bestseller, and presented an alternative conspiracy theory to what happened at JFK. Of course, there were lots of other books, most of them much better than Rush to Judgment, but for a variety of reasons that we'll probably explore later, Rush to Judgment was, a New York Times bestseller. And Mark Lane, basically used that as a jumping off point for his very long and illustrious career within the alternative community, the conspiracy culture, and beyond. And we'll get into all of his interesting connections in a little bit. But anyway, keeping that in mind, this is very much a alternative conspiracy theory to what happened in JFK, and there's quite a bit in there. But what's most interesting is that throughout the film, we have this conservative dark cabal, and they're plotting to do all of this, and they, of course, are filled. The Burt Lanchaster character is some sort of shadowy black ops specialist. We're not exactly sure what he does. He is, I guess, technically retired from the deep state, but he does operate, freelance for all these other people. And that's sort of who's behind this. And this is what's so interesting, is that they're obviously, all of these characters, Robert Ryan, Burt Lancaster, they're all quite familiar with the CIA and the intelligence world, and they employ ex-CIA agents. But the CIA really doesn't pop up at all in this film, and that was something that was particularly interesting to me. There's a scene where they're sort of trying to figure out, well, who can we blame this on? And they're like, oh, well, this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, he's great. And, it's this sequence, and they've got slides and actual pictures of Oswald. And they basically point out that based on his assignments and his sort of, his history of being this communist sympathizer, that he must be some sort of sheep-dipped CIA agent. Now, they don't use those exact terms, but that's essentially what they're presenting. And it's interesting. I mean, the film mentions his assignment in Japan. They mention Gary Powers, that he might have been somehow involved in that. It's something I had totally forgotten, but it just sort of jumped out at me. But Oswald was discharged from the military on September 11th, which is, I don't think there's any real connection there, but it's always interesting whenever, September 11th pops up in sure. films and other things like that.
Well, and in an intelligence legend.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know. Yeah, maybe there is something more to it. But this is something I wanted to sort of get your take on, Tom. So, as I said, this secretive group, they seem to know exactly who Oswald is working for. Yet, they're going to use him as a patsy. And this was just sort of odd to me. And again, this sort of goes back to Mark Lane's sort of thesis on JFK, where he basically, claimed that Oswald didn't do anything, that he was completely being used, that he was just an idiot, which is, I understand the idea that he was a patsy, and certainly, I mean, he admitted that before he was killed by Jack Ruby. But throughout the movie, they employ lots of different techniques to sort of incriminate Oswald. So they actually get a lookalike who goes around and talks about communism at a car dealership, and it's like, yeah, my name is Lee Harvey Oswald, remember that name. And there's a fight at a shooting range, and as far as I know, those are actual events. Those are part of the legend of Oswald.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, it's most likely the case is that there was someone else going around pretending to be Oswald, because he just couldn't have been in all these places at once. And again, I mean, who goes around, talking about how wonderful the Soviet Union is and how we should kill JFK. But this is something that I just couldn't wrap my head around. They keep doing this. And then there's even a sequence where they really make the case that the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, they're up to some other operation with Oswald. They somehow they're able to get information through, I guess, their sources within the government, but they know that everyone is watching Oswald, but no one is stopping him doing anything, buying weapons or, they know that he's a threat, yet they don't do anything about it. So there's almost this like parallel operation going on. I mean, what was your take on that? Because again, it was just sort of a bizarre interpretation of what was going on. Sort of like, well, the CIA, the FBI, and the Secret Service, they wanted to assassinate Kennedy as well. But then this other secretive group of businessmen and ex-intelligence agents, they wanted to assassinate him also. And they were both using Oswald, who the movie makes very clear knew nothing about anything that was going on. And he's just totally this idiot patsy who, but again, I mean, it's sort of like, well, why is he going around talking about communism? So I don't know, Tom, maybe you can kind of wrap your head around this.
Yeah, I know where you're coming from with this. It is a bizarre way to portray the JFK conspiracy for sure. I don't buy it, of course.
Yeah.
That's the first thing to say. But something like this could be true in as much as you could have a deep state conspiracy, but it would have to have more operatives within the intelligence services. That's the part of this story that's really unrealistic, is that this whole thing's being run through this one guy, Burt Lancaster's character. Mm-hmm. He's running the assassination teams, and he's running the patsies, and he's running the duplicate Oswald, and he's running the intelligence moles inside all of these different agencies that are giving them information, and it's all going through him. And then right at the end of the film, spoiler alert, right at the end of the film, they kill him off to break off their connection to all of these different things. The conspiracy group kill him off. So you got to wonder, that's the part that's really, really unrealistic. Not the notion of a, right-wing, deep state corporate conspiracy, but one that is acting through one agent who could thus do all of this different stuff within the intelligence services. That's the part that's really unrealistic to me. Specifically regarding JFK, the unrealistic part is that Oswald knew nothing. Oswald was a spook.
Yeah.
He knew he was a spook. Come on. How this film tries to pull that one on us is... That's one of the places where it really does start to lose anyone who's... I suppose we've got the benefit of, 50 years of hindsight, but people at the time probably didn't. And maybe that was the point, I guess that's where we're going with this interpretation of this film, isn't it? That possibly this is actually a dummy put out there, a false conspiracy theory about JFK. But I'm just saying, I always interpreted JFK as a Gladio-style operation, blamed on a patsy communist, probably carried out by people who lean towards fascism, and we're talking people both within the intelligence services and without. That's kind of how I would I always thought that was the most likely model for to explain what happened there, because this is just exactly this is what happened to Aldo Moro in Italy. It's not really any different fundamentally. It's a bit more grotesque and public in JFK's case.
Yes.
But it was pretty grotesque and relatively public in Aldo Moro's case. So, you know what I'm getting at here. If we view this conspiracy as it's portrayed as a kind of Gladio-style thing, it's moderately plausible. The point at which it really starts to fail, like I say, is that the notion that all of this intelligence stuff is being run by one guy. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be. You would have to have several other agents within different agencies doing different things at different times to make all of this happen. And like I say, you'd have to have Oswald at least having some idea that he was involved in an intelligence operation. Whether or not he knew that had anything to do with the president, probably not, or possibly not, at least anyway.
Yeah. No, I mean, like I said, the movie really plays up this idea that somehow Oswald is, going into Russia defecting, coming back, on an American military plane. He's being monitored by all of these groups, but no one really cares or stops him. And yet he has no idea about anything and is completely played for a fool, at the end. And then they hire Jack Ruby, who pops up out of nowhere. They don't mention him once. You see him
sure.
He gets kind of nervous and he's like, oh God, they're going to ask me to do something. And again, I mean, such a major player sort of in the overall conspiracy. It's sort of who was Jack Ruby, how was he connected to all of these people, which he was. If you start looking at some of the other actors in JFK, Jack Ruby pops up over and over again. Of course, Jack Ruby famously said he was a patsy, that there was much more to this conspiracy before he died mysteriously in prison. But in this, Jack Ruby just sort of pops up out of nowhere, and then he dies. Or they don't even mention that, I guess. They don't even get to that. But they're just like, whatever, throw that away. So yeah, it does seem like the overall thrust of this film really is to sort of, give us a glimpse of something, give us a different perspective on what happened, but ultimately leads you down a path that's just fraught with dead ends and made-up people. And again, we're going to get into more of that in a second, but I just wanted to pick up on, there's a couple other really interesting conspiracy memes and ideas that are put in this movie. One of them that I actually found really interesting, especially for a movie back then, is this scene between Robert Ryan and I believe it's Burt Lancaster, but it might be the Ferguson character, and they're basically talking about this fear of all of the black, brown, yellow people immigrating into North America and Europe, and that this is, they're all hungry and they all want to be our friends, is how the Robert Ryan character puts it. And he goes into this whole thing about how they have to decrease the population by some massive figure, and that's what Vietnam is all about, is just about decimating South Asia. And that if they can do it in Vietnam, then eventually they'll be able to do it to all of the minority groups here within America. And that this was really, they really pushed the idea that this was the one of the main driving forces behind the assassination. And I just found that really interesting. Again, a movie in 1973, and they're talking about eugenics. And that's just an interesting thing to sort of inject into this film. And I don't know, Tom, if you want to quickly just comment on anything like that, but I just wanted to point that out to everybody.
No, it is a curious one to find in a film, particularly at that time, which is roughly the same time as Kissinger was writing that notorious memo about depopulation being a massive, security concern for the United States, it being, depopulation being the answer.
Yeah.
So, yeah, curiously on the nose in that respect. But I would say this is, again, one of the problems with this movie, is that this right-wing corporate conspiracy is all over the place in terms of their motives for why they're doing this. There's no real discernible reason. It's like everything hinges on them killing Kennedy. Like, all right, if we can kill Kennedy, then we can win in Vietnam, and then we can kill all the black people and all the yellow people and all the poor white people, and we can basically just kill everyone. And then, the whole world would be dramatically different if we can kill Kennedy. And I can't help but also think, people must have been sat there in 1973, 74, 75, whenever they were watching this film, thinking, well, none of this actually happened. I mean, by that point, okay, Kennedy was dead, and that was I get that it was a kind of mass... It was a terror attack in the sense of it being an assault, a psychological assault on the public. People in America were very shocked by this. I get that, for sure. But, 10, 12 years later, that feeling has faded somewhat, and people must have felt, well, as shocking as that was at the time, we're all still here. So
we were just losing Vietnam in 73.
Well, yeah. So maybe some people were looking at that and thinking, well, maybe Kennedy did have the right kind of idea about Vietnam. But you know what I'm saying? They can't have felt that the world hinged on that event anymore. I can get why people might have felt that as soon as it happened, just as people did with 9/11 or any other major event like this. Watergate as well. People thought, oh, this is the beginning of a new something in politics. This is completely changed the scales and rebalanced everything. And but it never does it? No. None of these events fundamentally shift the paradigm.
No, not at all.
I mean, okay, 9/11 was then used as a pretext for a bunch of things that probably wouldn't have been anywhere near as easy without 9/11. But I think most of them probably would have been possible, ultimately. So it was a kind of revolutionary event in that it enabled them to do a bunch of things more quickly. I'd certainly say that much. But it's not like the world now, 15 years or so later, and then you look at the world 15 years before 9/11. Is it, in the most fundamental terms, that much different? Or is power actually functioning more or less as it always has?
I think that's almost a constant with a lot of these deep state events, is that they're not so much about altering power, but maintaining the status quo of power. So again, I mean, JFK represented a blip on their screen, and we've talked about this before, Tom, like when we were talking about 7 Days in May. But I really am of the mindset that JFK didn't represent that much of a threat, but he represented, even a minor threat to whatever the CIA, the deep state, oil companies, all of these different various groups, fascism. He represented enough of an irritating threat that they responded by blowing his brains out all over his wife in front of a massive crowd. And ever since then, of course, no one has even, remotely attempted some of the things that JFK did, in terms of talking about, how dangerous the CIA was and firing CIA officials and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right on that sort of idea that this is just, nothing really fundamentally changes after a lot of these events. I mean, it maybe makes things a little bit easier, but that's essentially it. And two other quick things that this movie really does, and then we'll get into Trumbo and Lane and all the others. But, again, as we said in the beginning, this really pushes the idea that Kennedy was this wonderful, heroic person. And there's a scene that I just found completely laughable where they're sort of like, well, do we need to assassinate him? And Lanchaster is like, oh, of course, there's nothing else. We can't find anything that can discredit him. A man who couldn't keep his dick in his pants, was doped up to the eyeballs on drugs, was corrupt.
Hanging out with film stars, taking acid. I mean,
yeah, exactly, taking acid and revealing state secrets while on acid. Injecting
and while sleeping with said Hollywood stars.
Yeah, exactly.
So forth. I mean,
you could discredit this guy a million ways from Sunday. And again, in many ways, it's an interesting idea, but that they didn't try and do something like that, because I think that might have been, then you can really take the whole Kennedy family down a notch. There's a scene where they're talking about, well, after 8 years of JFK, then we'll get Bobby Kennedy, and then Teddy Kennedy will come in, and it'll usher in a new era of liberal elitism and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, if you revealed that Kennedy was taking drugs, sleeping with everything that walked, and all of the brothers were doing that, then you could really destroy the Kennedy family. But instead, they sort of took this, let's make him into this untouchable hero. So that's an interesting thing, but again, really ridiculous that they couldn't find anything that could discredit him. And then lastly, and this sort of leads into what we're going to be talking about in a minute, but there's one of the really interesting things in this movie is they show the Adlai Stevenson speech in Dallas, where he was talking about the UN. And in it, they play the full thing where he starts getting booed, and it turned into this whole big, complete PR disaster for Stevenson. And he actually told, was quoted as saying that Kennedy shouldn't go to Dallas because it was such a hostile environment. Now, I bring that up, and it's, they don't touch on this whatsoever in executive action, but that was orchestrated by Edwin Walker, who we talked about before in our 7 Days in May episode. And Edwin Walker was a former military commander who was fired by JFK. He was beyond a right-winger, was a member of the John Birch Society, and he actually fits into the JFK assassination because he was mysteriously shot in his office in Texas, I believe. And this was blamed on Oswald, of all people. And of course, the man who fingered Oswald in this was his CIA handler, George de Mohrenschildt. And interestingly, Burt Lancaster played an Edwin Walker composite character in 7 Days in May. So I just found that interesting that they included it, but of course brushed aside any mention of this much larger right-wing fascist conspiracy. So very interesting. But perhaps maybe now we'll get into some of the real interesting stuff, and that's who is behind this film. And quickly, the director David Miller does actually have a little bit of history working with the Department of Defense in some capacity. He directed the 1942 propaganda film Flying Tigers, which starred John Wayne. And oddly enough, this depicted the secret U.S. Air Force unit that was working in China prior to World War II. They were trained in Burma, and they were actually technically a unit of Chiang Kai-shek's Air Force, but they were completely controlled by the U.S. Air Force. This was signed off by FDR. So interesting that Miller also directs this propaganda film about a clandestine military unit working in China, of all places. As we mentioned, Burt Lancaster was in 7 Days in May, and basically kind of continues his role. You could almost see him as he's the Edwin Walker type character in 7 Days in May, right? Then he has to resign from all of this, and you could almost imagine that he would wash up as his character in Executive Action. He's got all of this sort of inside intelligence. He knows how to hire right wingers to assassinate people. So, I mean, Tom and I always find that really interesting in movies, the sort of continual characters that we see that actors play over and over again.
I can only assume part of the reason they went after and pursued Burt Lancaster was for that reason, is because he carried with him that kind of connotation from the earlier film. Yeah. Oh,
yeah. And supposedly, I don't know if you saw this, Tom, but Donald Sutherland is actually credited with having the idea and with hiring Mark Lane and Donald Freed to write the screenplay. And then I think he abandoned it and he was doing something else or something. But of course, Donald Sutherland plays Mr. X in JFK, the composite character for Fletcher Prouty, who's a great disdain for, and is definitely some sort of psyop or disinfo agent. But again, really bizarre. Sutherland pops up in this as well, and then goes on to play a character similar to Burt Lancaster's. But as I said, the three most interesting people and what really makes this movie worth watching are Dalton Trumbo, Donald Freed, and Mark Lane. I don't know, Tom, why don't you kind of tell us a little bit about Dalton Trumbo and what you sort of were looking at in terms of this film, because he's a really interesting character and it's someone that definitely walks that thin line between Hollywood and the intelligence world.
Well, just quickly before I get into that, I do want to say, if you watch this film and you've seen Oliver Stone's JFK, you will notice quite a lot of similarities between Executive Action and JFK. The music at the beginning is almost identical. The whole film starts with a montage in kind of a similar way to it does in JFK.
Yes.
There are distinct similarities stylistically, and I'm sure Oliver Stone was trying to play on this film a bit when he made JFK. And of course, Donald Sutherland, correct me if I'm wrong, father of Kiefer Sutherland, the star of CIA-sponsored show 24.
Yes.
Anyway, Dalton Trumbo. This guy is a very odd one. Exactly where he is on the map is not an easy thing to figure out, because he was a American Communist Party member, but he was also a very pro-patriotic, pro-American, pro-war propagandist of sorts during World War II. I mean, the way it basically breaks down, in 1942, he was first labelled as a communist or a possible fellow traveller by the FBI. The following year, he actually joins the Communist Party. That's the same year he makes this film, Destination Tokyo? Is that what it's called? This DoD-assisted film that's very much a, pro-war, pro-DoD World War II movie. Then some FBI agents turn up at his house, asking him about various things. He invites them in, and he's perfectly willing to talk to them. and apparently kept in touch with them for some time afterwards. He also handed over letters that he'd received from people that he considered pro-fascist peaceniks, i.e. people who didn't want America in the war because they wanted fascist Germany to take over the world. So what exactly his relationship with the FBI was is not clear at that point. He then becomes a war correspondent for the War Department's Bureau of Public Affairs, so he's basically a War Department propagandist. Then, as the war's coming to a close, he becomes a special consultant to the Founding Conference of the United Nations, and he even wrote a speech for the Secretary of State for the United Nations Founding Conference. So that's all what's happening during World War II. Then, after the war, obviously the Cold War starts, and he, as a Communist Party member writing scripts in Hollywood and what have you, becomes a target. So he gets called before the House Committee on Un-American Affairs. He refuses to answer questions. He ends up being imprisoned, and he's one of the first Hollywood people to become blacklisted. He is, in fact, one of the Hollywood 10, the original blacklisted screenwriters and producers. So he spends a year in prison. He comes out. He subsequently writes a whole bunch of screenplays and various things, but mostly, well, all under pseudonyms and fronts. And other people even won Oscars taking credit for his work because he was using them as a front for his work. And when this story emerges, this is, obviously there is a predictable outrage. And this is actually the beginning of the end of the Hollywood blacklist in the late 60s, I think this was. So shortly before he wrote this film, or at least contributed to the writing of this film. I do think one interesting thing to notice about all of this is that the kind of change with Trumbo when he managed to start being able to take public credit for his work again, that happened after Eric Johnston, who was the head of the MPAA and a probable CIA asset, he had a heart attack and died in 63, and it wasn't until 66, 67 that Jack Valenti took over, and there was a somewhat different flavour with the MPAA from that point onwards, and this whole blacklist thing started to fall apart. So Dalton Trumbo is at the centre of all of this, right? That's the problem with him. He's all over the map because he's, pro-DOD, pro-war. He's also a communist. He gets blacklisted for being a communist, but he's also the guy who, or it's his story, effectively, that helps end the blacklisting process. So he both helped to sort of, his life, if you like, both started and ended that whole thing. So what do we make of him? Where exactly is he? Who exactly is he? Is not an easy question to answer. And then just on top of that, of course, you have this forthcoming biopic about Dalton Trumbo that's being directed by Jay Roach, who has directed 2 CIA-assisted movies, Meet the Parents and Meet the Fockers. And it's starring Bryan Cranston, Walter White.
And John Goodman.
Who, of course, both appeared in Argo, both starred in Argo, one of the most CIA, influenced movies of all time. So we are assuming the CIA are going to have some kind of involvement in that film. I can only guess they're not going to turn it into some kind of slapstick, gross-out comedy. But to be honest, from the people they've chosen and from their history with movies, you do wonder. But I don't know. Who is Dalton Trumbo? I'm really not sure at this point. He's a bit of a mystery to me.
No, absolutely. And again, just it's important to point out just that he really does seem to be at the center of all of this. And no one, there's just no one is a blacklisted commie who is constantly at the center of all of these things, working with the DOD. There must be something more to whoever Dalton Trumbo is. So,
and we kind of just sort of leave people with one question about this.
Sure.
Why would someone who has just been de-blacklisted as a communist after having their career effectively ruined by this process, why would they then go and write a movie advancing this quite radically alternative version of JFK and thus draw a load of attention and hassle to themselves once again? Why do that?
Yeah, a fascinating question.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I'm just that's kind of where we're going with this.
Yeah, again, he really does walk this very, narrow line between intelligence and Hollywood. And he's someone that me and Tom will definitely be picking up on in our CIA and Hollywood series at some point. Maybe not in season 2, but certainly in season 3 or 4. And we're both eagerly awaiting the film Trumbo. And again, if anyone wants a little bit more info on Trumbo and the whole Hollywood 10 and what may or may not have been going on, I definitely encourage them to listen to Tom's episode on that, because it's one of these events or subjects that's not really looked on very much by the alternative media, but it certainly is. It's got all of the makings of culture creation and control and all sorts of different aspects that you wouldn't even think of. But so as you said, we've got this former de-blacklisted communist writing this film, and the people who are helping him write this and doing all the research are two of the shadiest people in the conspiracy world and alternative media, and that again is Donald Fried and most importantly Mark Lane. Just quickly, I'll discuss Fried just because his bio is a little bit shorter. But he was a well-known conspiracy theorist, mainly writing about JFK. He's written several books on him. He also, I don't know if you knew this, Tom, he wrote a play all about the Rosenbergs that was quite famous. He was a big crony of Mark Lane's. He was notorious for never owning a copy of the Warren Commission, yet he managed, to write these voluminous books about JFK. And he's one of these characters who was able to get published in mainstream publishing houses. He had lots of books, lots of press, while most of the people really doing actual research were completely sidelined. And of course, the man sidelining all of these people, and someone who is certainly a CIA asset, if not a full-blown agent, is Mark Lane. Mark Lane, for anyone that doesn't know, was a lawyer. He's, as I said, the author of Rush to Judgment, the official conspiracy theory on, or the official alternative conspiracy theory on JFK. And again, the same thing. Mark Lane was able to get published when no one else could, and was very famous. He was on mainstream television. But he was also, not only was he actually testified at the Warren Commission. That's how, popular this guy was.
Up he was, yeah.
But he then pops up a few years later as the lawyer for James Earl Ray, and comes up with the same sort of tactic of the official alternative conspiracy theory about who killed Martin Luther King. And again, completely, didn't, like a lot of these lawyers who pop in and they try to save their client, he didn't save James Earl Ray at all. And James Earl Ray was, just lived most of his life in prison. And then, a few more years go by. Again, Mark Lane is, he's on big, news channels and radio shows. And then he pops up with his good friend Donald Fried as the legal counsel for none other than Jim Jones, the cult leader of the People's Temple. And Lane and Fried were tasked with proving that the CIA was after Jim Jones, and that this was all a CIA plot to destroy his wonderful church that was never a cult. And Mark Lane is very infamous as being one of only 2 or 3 people that actually lived through Jonestown. Of course, so he could fly back immediately to the United States and tell everyone about how the CIA killed everyone at Jonestown, and that really the CIA was after Jim Jones because they hated him because he was, for equality and communal living and all this sort of stuff. If that doesn't sort of make you wonder who the fuck is Mark Lane, I'll just give you a brief rundown of some of his friends. And most of this, I'll just mention quickly right now, comes from the research of one of my heroes, and that's Mae Brussel. And that's someone who I've certainly talked about before on the podcast. And anyone that is unaware of who Mae Brussel is or is not familiar with her work, definitely go out and listen to her old radio show, and I'll provide a link to a pretty good YouTube channel that's got 200 or so of her recordings. She made thousands, and she is really just the the original podcaster. She would do reel-to-reel tapes and then actually send them out to all of her listeners with show notes, with all of the citation and articles. And she was a real honest researcher. She was just a regular woman who didn't believe in what was going on with JFK and went out and bought every available thing that she could, including the Warren Commission, and combed through it. And she really developed lots of very fascinating theories and research, and not just on JFK, but also quite a bit on Jim Jones. She talked about MK Ultra when no one else would, all sorts of things, the Ronald Reagan assassination. But anyway, she also had a particular hatred of Mark Lane, because Mark Lane would sideline her and tried to destroy her career numerous times. He considered her a dangerous nut, barred her from testifying to Congress, suppressed all of her articles that used to be published by Larry Flynt until Mark Lane got involved with Larry Flynt, would ban her from speaking at conspiracy conferences, and basically didn't like any of May's research because she really did delve into the Nazi and White Russian influence around Oswald and Oswald's CIA connections. And again, Mae Brussel, just so ahead of her time, was talking about Operation Gladio. A lot of her research went into all of the Nazis and the fascists that the CIA brought over here, and how so many of them were intimately connected to what was going on in Dallas, and particularly with Oswald. And Mark Lane hated that, and was certainly a media whore and couldn't stand the sight of anyone else in the spotlight. But again, just quickly, Mark Lane's good friends. We have George O'Toole, who wrote a book called Assassination Tapes, and later, of course, had to admit that he was a former CIA agent, good friend of Mark Lane. Robert Groden, who's very famous, I'm sure, to many people in the alternative community. He worked at Life magazine, of course, the CIA's premier, one of their premier publications. He actually worked on the Zapruder film, which, of course, was obtained by Life magazine under mysterious circumstances. And Robert Groden is really famous for actually being the one that showed the Zapruder film on Geraldo Rivera's show alongside none other than Mark Lane. Donald Freed, as I said, worked with him and Jim Jones. And one of the really interesting good friends of Mark Lane, and someone that defended him over and over again, was Bernard Fensterwalt, who was part of Lane's Committee on Investigations and Assassinations, but he was also James McCord's lawyer during Watergate. He also opened up a law partnership with James McClandis, who was a former State Department intelligence official and was connected with Air America, the CIA's airline. And Fensterwalt's law offices were also in the same building as Intertel, which is a really interesting subject and something that people don't talk very much about. But this was this bizarre sort of like precursor to all private intelligence firms, and it was staffed by ex-CIA officials. And Intertel was sort of a security and consulting firm, but they were involved in Watergate. They were used by the CIA, the DEA, and all those sort of groups as a cutout organization. And they were also employed many times by Howard Hughes, which is a whole other podcast in and of itself. But anyway, so yeah, that's Mark Lane. And just to add, how much I despise this person. He then later in life, his new claim to fame was defending the Liberty Lobby and the American Free Press, which is something that I absolutely despise. It is this stupid, idiotic, right-wing, anti-Semitic newspaper that parades itself as some sort of alternative beacon. And he was very good friends with Michael Collins Piper, who is a nasty little scumbag who I'm glad is dead. And anybody that defends Michael Collins Piper should know that he absolutely loved Mark Lane, who was, by all accounts, a complete CIA asset and agent. So that's Mark Lane for you, everybody. Again, I don't know, Tom. What is your take on Mark Lane and perhaps his involvement in this movie and what he was trying to get out of by participating in this film?
Well, one thing that occurs to me, right, is that back in the 70s, he was making this film, and he was, defending Jim Jones? At least associated with Jim Jones.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, he's very much on the left, right? He's portraying this right-wing horrible conspiracy to take out Kennedy, who apparently on which the entire world's fate depended.
Yeah.
And he's also defending Jim Jones, who has this sort of bizarre, anarcho-communist? I don't know quite where you would put him ideologically, but certainly somewhere in that realm. And yet these days, or at least later, he's then defending the exact opposite, involved with the exact opposite. Yeah, you got to wonder about people like that, whose agenda doesn't seem to have any consistency or rhyme or reason to it, because I suppose there is another possibility. It's possible that he's just a psychopath, but he may also be a CIA asset as well. Certainly the crowd he's moving in, and at that time, and the sorts of things he's involved with and associated with, you've got to wonder, someone's got their hooks into that guy. Someone's getting him to do some of these things, I would guess. What's he trying to accomplish with this film? I guess not just to try and lay down a misleading alternative narrative, alternative conspiracy theory about JFK, and not just to do that for profit and for attention and everything, but also, I think, to kind of screw with the emerging movement that came out of that, perhaps. Because this isn't just about JFK. This is about, like you say, there was loads of researchers who were doing great work on JFK and other associated things. Not that I'm all that bothered about JFK, because I think the man himself was a pig, so who cares? But I understand politically and psychologically it had a lot more impact. That's the important thing. It's not JFK himself. And that emerging movement is what we now call the alternative movement, or the truth movement, or whatever. And like you say, Mae Brussell is a sort of prototype for modern podcasters. That whole thing is actually at least somewhat dangerous to the likes of the CIA. So, I mean, I'm just left thinking, like, at the end of the movie, I think it's at the end of the movie, they have this thing about all of the key witnesses dying and how statistically unlikely that is. And that's always been one of those arguments that, the popular JFK research movement, the alternative movement on JFK, has kind of hinged itself on. Just like with 7/7, people have hinged themselves on these statistical things of how unlikely it would be that Peter Power was running this exercise at the same time. Yeah. And it's like, who can come up with the biggest number? And the person who can come up with the biggest number of how unlikely it is the person with the strongest argument. And I just find that whole thing utterly kind of absurd. I mean, for one thing, statistical probability and real probability aren't the same thing. They're just not. I generally find that statistical arguments and numerical arguments are aimed at quite stupid people who are just impressed by big numbers for some unknown reason that I can't tell you what it is. But also, what does it matter how statistically unlikely it is that all these people would have died? The suspicious thing is that they died in such bizarre circumstances, and who they were and what they knew. That's what points to the conspiracy, because Oswald could not have killed those people, right? He was already dead, and he had no reason to kill them anyway. So that's the thing that's suspicious, is that witnesses to what may have been the additional conspiracy on the day of the Kennedy assassination is that they subsequently wind up dead in circumstances that look like hits and assassinations themselves. That's the suspicious part, not the statistical probability, right? Yeah. And yet, what does the film serve up? It serves up the ludicrously big number. It's the number that matters. It's not the fucking number that matters. It's the fact that these people were, in all likelihood, killed by the same conspirators who killed Kennedy himself. That's the argument that they should be making here. And so you see what I mean? It's just like with the Peter Power thing with 7/7, or just like with any number of other examples we could pull out from these sorts of black operations, is that one of the key elements to them is to twist not only give them an alternative narrative of what happened, but also give them a fixation on arguments that go nowhere. Because, let's face it, if people are going around talking about some ludicrous statistic that they can't even explain themselves anyway because they don't understand the mathematics behind statistical probability, it's just something they've read or heard someone say, that's not going to convince that many people. It's going to make people look like lunatics. And similarly, these other arguments that the film makes, like we were saying before about the intelligence thing, if people are going around saying, oh, no, you wouldn't have to have people in the CIA and FBI involved in this thing. It's like, well, of course you bloody would. How could you pull this thing off without at least a few people in a few key places and without, Hoover turning a blind eye for whatever reason he turned a blind eye, but we're pretty sure he did. So, you know what I mean? You couldn't do it without that happening. And so the whole movie is kind of setting you up, not just with an alternative storyline, but a whole set of arguments that aren't useful tools to people. It's kind of popularizing the crap, basically, and thereby poisoning this nascent truth movement, if you like.
Yeah.
That would be the purpose, as far as I can see it.
No, definitely. I mean, Mark Lane really, Mae Brussel, constantly referred to him as a member of the PCG, the Power Control Group, which is a term that Richard Sprout, who's a really interesting researcher, he kind of came up with. But yeah, that basically their entire function was to control all of the narrative of all conspiracy, and assassinations in particular. It didn't have to just be JFK, as I said. Lane pops up with James Earl Ray. He's really silent on RFK. He has nothing to say about that. Pops up again and again. And it is so much about, as you were saying, just sort of, throwing these big ideas like, the chance of all these 18 witnesses dying is 1 in 3 trillion. Isn't it suspicious that so-and-so was in Dallas at the same time? And that's it. That's the end of it. He doesn't go any further. Much of his argument was basically just like, well, Oswald didn't do it. That's the end of the story. And then he gets to go and testify at the Warren Commission. So again, sort of his credential, elevating himself to that level, but then also attacking the Warren Commission. And it's sort of like, well, why did you even participate? And why did you make sure that Mae Brussel couldn't go and testify or anything like that? So yeah, I mean, I think the movie is so interesting to look at in terms of distorting truth and reality, but also so much about, the alternative community. Again, something we've talked about before, Tom, is that this whole, there's a lot of talk right now about, this person's a disinfo agent and that person's a psyop and blah, blah, blah. And there really are these blinders up when it comes to some of the, the sort of historical figures that are very much were at the forefront of the alternative research community. People like Fletcher Prouty is considered, everything he says is gospel, because he let us into who was really behind JFK, and he wrote this crazy book, and he was on, all these great conspiracy shows in the past. And then, where does Fletcher Prouty end up is working for Scientology, a group that, at least on some level, has some connection to the intelligence world. So again, the same thing with people like Mark Lane, people, all of these characters. Like I said, I mean, Michael Collins Piper gets held up over and over again as being, this sort of voice of sanity. And he's hobnobbing with this guy who's, every one of Mark Lane's friends were either connected directly to the CIA or, one removed from them. So, just to sort of, turn that, to kind of close on that thought is just that, as we've said before, this goes back much further. There are much deeper roots. And what interested me with this movie, you were saying at the beginning, that Oliver Stone definitely took elements from this. And that's what's so powerful, I think, with this film is that it, from 1973 on, the film, even if it didn't make the impact that, say a movie like JFK did, the mere fact that it influenced it, and that Stone was, probably trying to craft a movie based around this, shows the power that some of these individuals have. And again, shows the power of Hollywood. And that even a low-budget film like Executive Action can have this cultural impact and this research impact that people are still, falling down into these dead ends with JFK. Or still, pointing to Mark Lane's work as being something that's legitimate. And again, so much of what Mark Lane and Donald Freed especially, and some of these other characters, they would just say something, and then that was it. That was the end of it. They didn't have to have footnotes. They didn't have to cite quotations or anything like that. Just them saying something was enough for people to believe. And that's so much of this movie is just, oh, well, this is what it is, and that's the end of it. We don't need to get into any of the details about, well, what was the CIA doing ignoring Oswald? No, it's okay. We'll just say that they ignored him, and then that's the end of it. So, yeah, I mean, really, as we said, just a strange movie, definitely worth watching. And I know there's lots of, everyone, when we announced that we were doing an episode on this, everyone tweeted us with, no, this is the best JFK assassination film. And some of them do seem interesting. I got a tweet this morning about one that has Gene Hackman and Chase Brandon's cousin Tommy Lee Jones in it. So that one might be interesting to take a look at.
Well, and Tommy Lee Jones is in JFK as well. Which
yes, he is.
Curious piece of casting, but
right.
I mean, just to kind of sum up my thinking on this film, I think that it's like a lot of the films we've looked at, Eyes Wide Shut, Wag the Dog, even 7 Days in May. You think these films are kind of like truther films, if you like. They have that flavour, at least, about them. They have just enough in them to make you think, oh, right, this is on my side. This is on the side of people who are genuinely interested in asking real questions about how power works. But with all of them, possibly with the exception of Eyes Wide Shut, I would say they're kind of leading you up the garden path a bit. And they certainly have some kind of sting in the tail. They have some kind of thing that, like Wag the Dog, ultimately ends up in a really quite depressing place for a comedy movie. It has this really, really dark underbelly, as we've discussed before. 7 Days in May, it's a bit difficult to know where to place that one, in at least on the spectrum of this thing. But with this one, I would place it relatively far along the spectrum of, towards probable CIA disinformation movie, if you like. Give false hope to truthers movie. I don't know, whatever you'd call it. I think that one very much fits into that paradigm and in that part of the spectrum. And it is something people kind of... one of the reasons why we discuss these sorts of movies is because it's something people need to be aware of, is that mainstream entertainment is well aware of this whole alternative movement thing going on, and they're very much willing to play around with it, partly to try and suck some of those people in and get some money out of them, but also to see if they can have an influence on it for various different agendas and reasons. In this case, given who and what Mark Lane is, we have to wonder, is the CIA got some kind of sneaky hand in the background of this movie? Or at least that's the direction we would encourage people to kind of speculate in, if you like. But yeah, just be aware that this kind of movie exists, and that people who make these kinds of movies are sometimes trying to play these sorts of games with us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's so funny the way, a lot of people will bemoan Hollywood and things like that, and even we've gotten some people sort of commenting on our CIA and Hollywood series, and they're sort of like, oh, how can you watch these propaganda films and whatnot? But those are the same people that think that V for Vendetta is some sort of truther film, or that The Matrix is the ultimate look behind the curtain, or even movies like Eyes Wide Shut, which we sort of had when we were discussing that, slightly different. That maybe Kubrick wasn't really warning us. Maybe he was just sort of telling us that this is that he was part of this secretive group or whatnot. So yeah, I mean, it is something to keep in mind and something to look to. And again, I mean, the mainstream totally is into conspiracy culture, more so now than even a few years ago. I mean, every movie is a conspiracy. Every TV show has this intricate conspiracy, and some of them are quite good, and some of them are really entertaining, and some of them are very smart. But it's important to be aware of that, and to be careful and weary of promoting some of these truther films, or thinking that, it's okay because they sort of talk about some of the things that I like, so it's all right to promote a film that Mark Lane helped to write and craft. And of course, Mark Lane, got so upset and hated the movie and, publicly condemned it and whatnot. And that's just a classic tactic that he would use, to sort of remove himself from the film. But, I'm sure he didn't give two shits about how the movie came out, because he was on to go, move to Guyana with Jim Jones and help them, stop the CIA from destroying them.
Sure. Mission accomplished. On to the next one.
Yeah, exactly. And that's totally how Mark Lane, his whole career has worked. He went from JFK to MLK to Jim Jones to the Liberty Lobby to the American Free Press, and I'm sure we'll see Mark Lane at some point pop up again. He's still alive, although he is very quiet right now, which is interesting. But anyway,
unfortunate, we should say.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, just to keep that in mind, that there's always a lot more going on in these films, and this is a really interesting one. Again, because it does really portray the conspiracy in a very realistic sense. I do think the coldness that we see with the these right-wing conspirators is probably very accurate. I'm sure that when the fascist deep state Gladio type thing was formulating killing JFK, they were probably very matter-of-fact about it, because that's the nature of these people. They are psychopaths, and they don't really have empathy or feeling, and they view anything from going to the store to buy a pack of cigarettes or blowing out someone's brains all over their wife is pretty much the same act. There's not a whole lot of difference between the two with them. But again, there's always this lurking. There can be this lurking force behind them. But I don't know, Tom. Any quick thoughts before we end the conversation?
Well, I just want to say my favorite scene in the whole movie, or at least the scene that I find the funniest, is when Burt Lanchaster is going to meet the head of one of the assassination teams, and they're sitting in a little diner somewhere, and for no reason I can possibly fathom, they have them sat outside directly next to an open window, so anyone who's inside the diner could overhear that conversation where they're sat there talking about secret bank accounts in Switzerland and how everyone will be given false passports and new identities and get out the country after they carry out this assassination. And they even practically say who it is they're assassinating in that conversation. Yeah, right. And like I say, this is all next to an open window inside, next to a diner full of people. And I just found that whole scene, it's this terrible tradecraft for a spy. It really is. In a film that is otherwise quite, carefully crafted to give it that feel of a real black operation. That's the one scene that stuck out like a sore thumb, where I just thought they would never do that. But, yeah, that's just me being a bit nerdy. Yeah, to be honest, I think we've said most of what it is, where we're going with this movie. I do recommend people watch it. It is a very interesting. I do enjoy this movie in a lot of ways, despite the kind of kitschness of it and everything else. But it's a very interesting one and a very provocative one. But don't, as with all of these sorts of movies, don't get too sucked into it, because there is some relatively dangerous, misleading stuff in there, I would say. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. And Tom, thanks so much for joining us on the return of Porkins Policy Radio and on this special 35th episode. So thanks again, Tom, and I'm sure we'll be talking very soon.
Thank you, Pierce. It's been great talking to you about this.
All right. Well, that about does it for this 35th episode of Porkins Policy Radio. If you enjoyed this podcast and you would like to hear some more of my work, then please go to porkinspolicyreview.com. And there, of course, you can find every single episode free for download. You can also go to my YouTube channel, which I hope you subscribe to, which is youtube.com/1138porkins. And there, of course, you can also find not only this podcast, but all the other podcasts that I do, including Porkins' Great Game with my good friend Christoph Gehrman, and also the CIA and Hollywood series that I do with Tom Secker here. And if you like this work, then please do support in any way that you can. Put it up on your social media. Tell your friends about it. Every little thing helps. Of course, subscribe through the RSS feed or through email blasts, as I said. Subscribe on YouTube, and always follow me on Twitter at Porkins Policy. Well, I just have a few little quick things. Again, I just wanted to mention, my sincerest apologies for such a long wait in between episodes. It's just been a really busy time right now. I'm sure most of, if not all of my listeners are aware that I am now a partner producer at boilingfrogspost.com, the website, of course, of Sibel Edmonds. And I'm doing the BFP Roundtable series, which is a video series, which is a whole other mess of work, and it's been quite a steep learning curve for me in terms of video editing. But between that and all the other podcasts that I've been doing lately, it's just been a little bit difficult to sit down and do the Porkins Policy Radio episodes. But rest assured, I have a bunch of episodes in the making right now. I think the next one should be on the MEK. I know I've mentioned that before, but I've been doing quite a bit of interesting research into that. So, I just wanted to say thanks, everyone, for sitting there and waiting and patiently for new episodes. There's going to be a whole bunch more new episodes coming out within the next 2 months or so. I'll have a little bit more free time to work on all of that. But again, thank you all so much for listening. I hope that you continue to listen to Porkins Policy Radio, as well as all of my other podcasts. As I said, Porkins Great Game, the CIA and Hollywood series, which Tom and I are currently working on right now. We don't have any, I don't have any specific details right now, but we do have a rough idea of the movies that we're going to be looking at this second season. And I just will say right now that we're going to have some really interesting, fascinating guests. Hopefully some people that the listeners won't be all that familiar with, but some really interesting work that they've all been putting out there. And again, if you're not a subscriber to boilingfrogspost.com, I really encourage you to go out and subscribe. It is in my opinion, not just because I work there, but the best source for independent geopolitical news and analysis. And of course, I absolutely love doing the video roundtable series there. But anyway, I'll stop rambling on right now. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will be talking to you very soon.
Right now it's time to take out the jams, motherfucker! We all got it too, no when the dressing room got hazy now, baby. I know how you want it, child, quick and tight. The girls can't stand it when you're doing it right. Let me up on the stand and let me kick out the jam. Yes, kick out the jam. I have to kick them out. Yes, I'm starting to sweat, my shirt's all wet.